And meanwhile, President Trump's Ukraine envoy striking a very different tone from his boss after a high-stakes meeting with President Zelensky. Envoy Keith Kellogg in Kyiv to discuss Trump's plans to end the war in Ukraine. The meeting coming during a tense time between Trump and Zelensky. Kellogg posting on Twitter a long and intense day with the senior leadership of Ukraine. Extensive and positive discussions with Zelensky, the embattled and courageous leader of a nation at war, and his talented national security team. Now, earlier this week, Zelensky expressed frustration. He wasn't invited to U.S.-Russia talks on ending the war. Trump responded by blaming Zelensky for starting the conflict and calling the Ukrainian leader a dictator. The New York Post took a swipe at Trump with today's headline, "This is a dictator," over a photo of Vladimir Putin. Vice President Vance defended Trump's approach to ending the war, saying his #1 goal is lasting peace.
How are you going to end the war unless you're talking to Russia? You've got to talk to everybody involved in the fighting if you actually want to bring the conflict to a close. Peace is in the interest of Russia. It's in the interest of Ukraine. It's in the interest of Europe. But most importantly, peace is in the interest of the American people, and he's going to fight for it for the remainder of his administration.
And here now, Andrij Dobriansky, Director of Communications and Media for the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. Andrij, it's always great to see you. You know, ending the war, that has massive support, but the devil's in the details here, as you know. We're hearing these bold statements by President Trump targeting Ukraine's leader now. How are you reading Trump's moves as they relate to strategizing a way to have this conflict eventually come to some type of positive conclusion, perhaps?
Everything old is new again, because I'm not sure if I'm listening to President Trump or, say, an administration in the late 2000s. President Obama famously declined to react to Russia's action in advance of the war by calling it not an enemy of the United States. President Obama also kept the same exact strategy of President Trump by saying that that Ukraine is in Russia's sphere of influence and we don't need to be involved in it. Both of these presidents didn't want to send weapons to Ukraine. And famously, those are the two presidents of all the United States presidents who've decided not to step foot on Ukrainian territory. And that's the big difference when you see Keith Kellogg. Keith Kellogg has been to Ukraine before. He is there now. And it's a very stark difference when you see a man of distinction like former General Kellogg talk about the effects of war and what's happening and how the best strategy is to help it, as opposed to people who refuse to actually go visit Ukraine, whether that's Pete Hegseth, whether that's J.D. Vance, whether that's President Trump. All of them have no understanding of what we're talking about. And what we're talking about when they say peace, they're talking about peace with your neighbor. This is an aggressor state. And this is a state of pure evil. As we approach not just the anniversary of the war, we're approaching the anniversary of the first tragedies we saw, the war crimes in Bucha. And those need to be answered for in some way. And I would love to hear their interpretation of how you answer for the crimes there.
Are you hopeful Zelensky will be at the negotiating table for these next round of peace talks? How vital is his presence there, and what are you anticipating?
I believe that Ukraine is going full steam ahead with their plans. Whatever the United States wants to interact, like with Keith Kellogg or with phone conversation, that's all well and good. But until they come and visit and understand the problems that are happening, they really don't know what they're talking about. So Ukraine is visiting with many states right now, not only those in Europe. They just signed a major free trade agreement in the United Arab Emirates, which is going to open up a lot of investment across the entire Middle East into Ukraine and from Ukraine out to those areas as well. So Ukraine is going ahead with whoever wants to support it. And if the United States seems to be shrinking back from that, I think that's a loss for the United States, because we all know what great friendships became of the United States supporting Great Britain, supporting France, even supporting Poland during World War II. This is the kind of friendship that the United States had on the table that this current leadership seems to be turning its back on.
You know, Trump has called into question Zelensky's popularity in Ukraine. This has been a difficult war, just in terms of resources for both sides, Russia and Ukraine. How would you characterize the Ukrainian leader's popularity at this hour?
Whenever you attack a country under war, rhetorically, like President Trump is doing, all that's going to do is rally the country around. We've seen that in Canada, an enormous amount of patriotism around being Canadian and how that's different from being an American because they are a sovereign country. Same thing for Ukraine. When people speak negatively about President Zelensky, he is the embodiment of the Ukrainian nation. When people speak negatively about an ambassador, like Speaker Johnson did last year about Ambassador Markarova, she is a full-fledged ambassador of the country. She represents the people of Ukraine. So you are, in effect, insulting a people. And so that's the difference between leaders that we see in the G7 and how they're incorporating the language of aggression. I would incorporate the language of pure evil just because of the acts of sexual violence against women as old as 82, children as young as 8. This is what happens on a monthly basis in Ukraine, and it's reported and documented by the United Nations. So that's why I really feel that the only way for the United States to really understand what's happening and go forward is to have the president go visit Ukraine and go visit the front line, go further than President Biden.
You know, we're waiting to hear from the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, at CPAC, but here's what he had to say at a White House briefing.
President Trump is obviously very frustrated right now with President Zelensky. The fact that that he hasn't come to the table, that he hasn't been willing to take this opportunity that we have offered. I think he eventually will get to that point, and I hope so very quickly.
Do you believe, Andrij, Ukraine can successfully defend itself without the full support of the U.S.?
Ukraine will defend itself. That's the major thing to realize. People think that when they listen to Russian propaganda, some of which is repeated by the president, by the vice president, by members of administration, people think that Ukraine is being forced into this war because of the United States.
And I apologize for interrupting.
Sure.
He is taking the stage right now. Mike
family
Waltz.
here in terms of progress that's being made.
Well, let me make one thing clear. We would not be in this position, not even close, if it weren't for the leadership of Donald J. Trump. Period. Right? I had the honor of sitting in the Oval Office and listening to President Trump speak with President Putin of Russia and hearing both Putin and then immediately Zelensky both say only under President Trump's leadership, say this to him, and only he could drive an end to this war. So under Trump, this war will end, and it will end soon, and he is the president of peace. And it amazes me how many people in this town are clutching their pearls and having conniption fits over what? Because President Trump's ready to stop the killing, stop the hundreds of thousands of people that are dying per year in Europe, the largest war in Europe since World War II. And you see the same voices that are demanding a ceasefire in Gaza post-October 7th, then what, oppose peace in Europe? It makes no sense. But with his leadership, we've now opened negotiations. We're sitting down with our host, the Saudis, and talking to the Russians, understanding what they are going to need, and then understanding what the Ukrainians are going to need, talking to all of the Europeans. You can't end a war if you don't talk to both sides, and that's what we're doing.
Thank you.
It's kind of common sense.
We certainly appreciate you standing by. I apologize for the interruption, but we'd love to get your reaction to those statements.
Again, we'd love to see Congressman National Security Advisor Waltz visit Ukraine today. He has been an incredibly staunch supporter of Ukraine, and a lot of his rhetoric now stands in complete contrast to what he's signed on to letters to President Biden and administrations before that. Same thing with Marco Rubio. They have stood firmly in support of Ukraine. And they should listen to their Senate counterparts who are disgusted with the language of sitting down and meeting with war criminals. Putin is a war criminal. He has ordered not only the breaking of the peace, but as I mentioned before, many instances of sexual violence, the killing of 600 children, the targeting of maternity hospitals and a children's cancer ward with ballistic missiles. There is no simply sitting down with people across the table like that. That the aggressor state here is trying to eliminate the entire concept of Ukraine. So he's approaching this as some kind of business deal, talking about minerals. Ukraine is talking about the survival of its people, the survival of its language, the literal survival of its churches that are being bombed. It's really hard to wrap your head around this language that Mike Waltz used as a congressman and the language that he's using now.
Andrij Dobriansky, it's always great to see you. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you. It's great seeing you too.